Hello, everybody, and thank you for having me. This talk is going to be quite a high-level talk. Like Matt said, I've been in cybersecurity for about 20 years, so it's a bit of a history and what it's been like to be a defender for these past 20 years and how things have evolved and what I've learned, if anything. It does make me feel quite old asking to do this, and when looking at some of the history, it made me realize that actually some of these attacks are older than my recent new apprentice. But yeah, that just goes to show my age. Like I say, I was at GCHQ from 97 till 2012, and now I'm CISO of Nominet. You may not have heard of Nominet, but I guarantee you will have used our services. We're best known for running the .uk domain, and we handle 2 billion DNS requests every day. And we also run, DNS can be used in defense. So we run the protective DNS service for the NCSC that protects about 1.5 million government users and blocking about, we block millions of events every month. So looking at this picture, the evolution of the cyber attack, I actually still think we're in very much the early days of cyber. I remember going back to about 2006, and I had a new boss, and I was trying to explain to him what cybersecurity was all about. In fact, it was probably called information security then. And he was like, wow, this is just the beginning. And he's absolutely right, and we're still in the beginning. We have come a long way. I think one of the best things I can say is that now cyber is on most CEOs' radar. It's probably on their risk registers. But where we haven't done very well is you just need to look at IoT devices. We have not got to that kind of secure by design panacea that we'd like to get to. And also, when you look at a lot of the incidents that happen, they're still using vulnerabilities. In the case of TalkTalk, the vulnerability, the SQL injection, was older than they actually were, the perpetrators. So we've still got kind of a long way to go. So, first generation, sort of turn of the millennium. This is when I first got into cyber, and in the real world, you had email viruses like Melissa and I Love You, for those that remember. It was a real annoyance that just clogged up your inbox and then, spammed everybody that you knew, and it was really embarrassing, and you had to clean it up. But in GCHQ, I remember being given the target. We were aware that nation states were going to be developing some cyber capability. This was all about sort of intelligence gathering, what you'd expect. And so we were aware that they were likely to be doing it against, the UK is a target, UK government assets, and also the critical national infrastructure. So it was kind of like, right, come on then, Cath. I was from a kind of data mining background. Here's a load of network traffic. Go and find the smoking gun. And 3 weeks later, that was found, not by me, but somebody found it. And from then on, I can say things just accelerated. And in those early days, the sort of indicators that we were using were very primitive because the security market wasn't evolved. There was nothing there to help us, really. So it was using primitive things like IP addresses and domain names again, or SMTP headers to try and track the adversary and see what they were doing, and notifying the victims and telling them how to clean things up. So that was kind of tricky. And then going back to the real world, we move on to some of the things like SQL Slammer and Kubeface. So these were worms. Kubeface was, if you redo the letters, it's Facebook, and that was a malicious worm on Facebook. And SQL Slammer, and again, they were doing sort of lots of damage. But it was unclear what their intent was, other than just to be kind of malicious. They weren't getting much monetary value from it. But what was clear is that their investment, the criminals' investment into these tools that they were developing, led them down a path where they were dedicated to doing stealth at scale and perfecting the need to stay hidden while harvesting this data. And very quickly, they could develop polymorphic malware so that it could avoid detection by antivirus and things. So it was kind of the start of this arms race where antivirus were trying to find ways to detect it, and then they were saying, oh no, they'll add things into their malware so it can detect when it's in a sandbox type arena. So like I say, it was sort of the start of the arms race. And it was also the start of when malware became a commodity with the dark web. So, you know, the start of when you didn't actually need to be a criminal. You could sort of buy and sell it and buy and sell data on the dark web. And then moving on to kind of like late noughties, there were two events that I really remember. 2007, you may recall Lockheed Martin got compromised, and the blueprints for the F-35 Joint Striker jet were stolen. This was major. I mean, not just from a defensive perspective, Lockheed Martin, a big defense contractor in the States, it was extremely embarrassing for them. But what it showed was like China's aggression in that intellectual property space as well. And you can see they've now launched their J20, well, you can draw your own conclusions. But yes, the Chinese have a real mission to accelerate their growth, and they do it by stealing intellectual property. The other attack of interest was the first one that was like a cyber warfare against Estonia. And whether this was Russia or just patriotic hackers, they were annoyed that Estonia had moved some statue from the Soviet era. And so Russia retaliated by massive DDoS, massive attacks, and it really affected Estonia as a country. But the kind of good news out of that was Estonia has become one of the leading countries in the world. They've got a massive cybersecurity program, and their government infrastructure is really quite secure. But that was one of the sort of game changes that we saw. And then moving on to one, I remember, does anybody remember Conficker starting? I mean, Conficker went wild, and it went everywhere, and it was really difficult to stop because it was one of these first ones that had like domain generating algorithms, and so, you know, to defend it was really difficult. And it was also unclear what the intent is. I don't think people still don't know whether it was criminal, it just kind of went bad, but it wasn't for monetary gain. It was sort of mentioned, could it be somebody just flexing their muscles and seeing how far their capability could get? But what is really frustrating is that, you know, we still see Conficker today. In some of our, you know, when we do this protective DNS, we are still seeing Conficker live and well on many networks, which is not great. Some of the other attacks, HB Gary, that were claiming that they could affect Anonymous, and then they retaliated and put all their data on the web, which was very embarrassing to them and their customers. And also Operation Aurora. This was where large suppliers such as Google, Yahoo, Juniper, and Adobe were attacked. And it was the first instance of where you had to be conscious of not just your own backyard, but your suppliers. I mean, the fact that Google and their Gmail was compromised, and they were really attacking and getting lots of intelligence that way, that was quite scary. And then, of course, moving on to, you know, sort of the second generation, we're talking about some of the things like Stuxnet. We've all heard of Stuxnet, where it was very precision, and it had a particular effect that it needed to do. And it was also where things moved into the real world. You know, it wasn't just like cyber and intelligence gathering and things like that. This had a real world effect on their nuclear armament mission. And also the Fancy Bear, I'm sure you've all heard of this, but against things like the Ukrainian power grid. So, you know, the spat between Russia and Ukraine, you often see these parallel cyber attacks, but the fact that they were able to take out parts of the Ukrainian power grid and then affect consumers in the Ukraine was pretty massive. And as in the previous talk where we were talking about AI, this kind of capability is only likely to increase, as is the current trend in information warfare or assault on fake news. So before I should say that, yeah, where are we now in terms of the modern threat landscape? I mean, unfortunately, yes, it's an amplification of all these effects, and it's characterized by just the volume, capability, variance, and better obfuscation. And just some stats that I want to share with you that I found staggering when I was doing this research. So number one, since 2014, the total amount of malware has tripled. So now there's almost 1 billion variants of malware out there, which is, you know, difficult to defend against. Secondly, we touched on DDoS, and DDoS is a big threat to the .uk domain name business. You know, availability is our key thing. We want to make sure the internet keeps working. So we monitor DDoS quite closely, and even since 2014, the largest DDoS attacks have quadrupled. And I used to go into the board sort of saying, you know, yes, it's our biggest risk, but don't worry about it. It would have to be kind of state-sponsored because we've got lots of capability and mitigation measures in place. I don't say that anymore. I now say, you know, it's not if, it's when. I think one of the concerning ones, the step change, was the Mirai botnet a couple of years ago, which utilised vulnerabilities in IoT devices so they could just get this absolutely massive capability that was, that was around a terabyte a second, and it took out a very capable provider, Dyn, that then affected lots of other services like Yahoo. And then thirdly, ransomware. You know, we've talked about WannaCry and things like that. Ransomware has increased 5-fold in the last year alone. And, you know, WannaCry was in the news, as NotPetya was. Hugely concerning, took out the NHS, took out Maersk, and horrendous. And yet it's still happening. People still aren't putting their backup strategies in place. So that's really concerning. And also the fact that, you know, the exploits used, it's like a cyber weapon. The Eternal Blue was something developed by NSA, escaped out into the wild, and then tried to sell it to the highest bidder. In the case of WannaCry, that was, I don't know if they bought it, but North Korea got hold of it and created WannaCry, created this ransomware purely for financial gain. And then in the case of NotPetya, it caused a huge amount of damage against Maersk, but it was initially targeted at Ukraine, again, part of that Russia-Ukraine spat. So we're in a pretty difficult place. So to analyse the threat in more detail, this is a slide shot. We look through a DNS lens. We handle billions of requests every day through DNS. And so, you know, it's quite interesting to analyse the threats at the different levels. Because nowadays, it's highly unlikely that you will actually see the initial threat, the initial attack vector that comes in, whether it's the executable or being able to patch in time. You know, it's really hard as a CISO to keep up with absolutely everything. So it's really hard to catch the executable before you get it. So instead, we're trying to look at different ways of spotting the narrative of the whole attack, a bit like the kill chain. People, I guess, have heard of that. And so you're pulling together like digital anomalies and outlying events, which in isolation might just seem like, you know, one particular thing, but overall you might see a broader picture. So on the right-hand side, this is an example of phishing. You know, we've talked about phishing a lot. It is an absolute pain, and we're trying our best. Like I said earlier, in .uk, we use machine learning and regular expressions to try and find domain names that look like phishing, and so we block them, we suspend them even before they go out to cause damage. But we're also monitoring like the behavior of what a phishing attack looks like. And on the right there, you can see it's registered, and then immediately, as soon as it's registered, then they launch their attack. And most of the activity happens within like the first hour, day, or something like that. So for the defenders, the people that are coming up with the threat intelligence to put into their systems, it's really hard to keep up. So you're sort of on the back front. So we're trying to model this kind of behavior to detect it before it comes through into like the threat intelligence. And then, you know, midway through the attack, you know, you've got things like command and control. Often DNS is used. You can see the beaconing. Same with domain generating algorithms. So these can be all indicative of an attack. And then finally, often the attacker needs to get the data out. And DNS is an easy way of doing that. They often add exfiltrated data into the DNS, because DNS, you need to have DNS for things to work, so the ports are open. So that's often used to exfiltrate data. So within our tools, we can look for that and try and stop it and prevent it, or alert people. So what I'm trying to say is modern defense is about sort of understanding how the narrative of how an attack plays out, knowing the anomalies and trying to spot them. So, for the future, where to be? And I have to say, just as an aside, Nominet, we did some research, people research on CISOs and what their job's like. You know, I've talked about the threats. We all know they're really getting, increasing. It's a good thing that security is now on boards mostly. You know, CEOs are aware of it. But for the humble CISO like myself, there is a growing concern. So we did this global study, and a quarter of CISOs reported that they've got this increased stress and there's concern of mental health because of the amount of stuff that they have to deal with and this increasing threat. A third of them fear for their job. Ultimately, if you get done, is that you for the chop? It is a concern. It's not often you go to the board as a CISO and say, hey, I've got some great news for you. It's usually bad news, or you're kind of asking for money. And half of CISOs say they're not getting enough budget. And if going back to the stats I was showing earlier, to try and compete with that increasing threat, you've never got enough budget, you've never got enough people. So, in my mind, how do you combat this increasing threat? Again, we have talked about AI, and that does have a place and to be innovative. But in my view, this is not just about tech versus tech. People are ultimately behind attacks, and people think in creative, non-linear ways. So human influence on the defending side is really critical. I'm a passionate believer in things like threat modeling exercises where, and it's not just about the CISO and the security team to defend a company. If you bring in all of your, whether it's the developers or the sysadmins, and you talk about your organization and the infrastructure and get them to think like an attacker and do these threat modeling exercises, then you will get a really good risk assessment. Because ultimately my job, it's all about risk. And getting value for money. And so, it's not just about buying a box and saying, oh yeah, that's going to be great, that's going to solve our problems, because it may actually cost you because you have to manage it, and then you have to deal with all the false positives and things. So not necessarily is it just about tech. I mean, I come from a technical background, but when I went into the CISO role and doing sort of ISO 27001, and you have to tick off a lot of the human factors, and it was like, oh yeah, whatever. But actually the training and getting people involved is a huge part of my job, and really important, and actually really rewarding and valuable. And one of the best, most cost-effective things I've put in recently is, it's called Boceron, comes from a startup, through the Cylon accelerator. And they basically, it's about making it, the gaming, the cybersecurity in the business. So as well as providing training and phishing exercises, things like that we're all aware of, it also allows us to reward or punish. But they have a whole score, each individual has a score, and also the teams have a score. So just by this simple gamification, I've managed to get a lot more of my organization on board. So they're much more likely to come up and say, oh, I've seen this vulnerability, how can we deal with it, rather than just leaving it to the CISO function. But yeah, skills are in such short supply, and we really need to build more on that. Intelligent insights and actions, it's not just about more data. As the big data age gathers pace, it brings with it an assumption that more data is better. That's so not true. My team have to deal with hundreds, if not thousands, of alerts every day. And so it's really important to really find that needle in the haystack. And then finally, the education side of it, understanding the narrative in attacks and the thinking of attackers is absolutely crucial. Whilst many in charge of large enterprises are well informed, you don't have to go far down the scale to find smaller companies with a single IT person struggling to keep up with their tech estate. The supply chain is, I think, the the story of our times in terms of we really need to fix it. As AI and everything gathers pace, the supply chain is the weak spot, and so it's not just about your organisation, it's about trying to make sure that your own supply chain is secure as well. And then finally, really, I was going to say the internet wasn't designed to be secure, but there are lots of tools out there. It's kind of an appeal to use things like DMARC, two-factor authentication, secure email. Organizations, it doesn't cost that much money to put in the basics. It's basic hygiene, and it can really improve an organization's stance on security. But finally, I wanted to say, really, this is an innovative conference, and hopefully there's lots of startups here. I meet lots of startups in the course of my job. It's great to get out there and see what they're doing, but it's really an appeal to please don't sell on FUD and it's such a growing problem and we're going to solve it, we're the panacea. Please appeal to the cost benefit. What is it going to give me? How is it going to make my life easier? I've recently moved into, my new boss is now the Chief Financial Officer of Nominet, which is quite unusual for a CISO, but I can definitely recommend it because he's not really interested in tech. He wants to know when I go to him and say, can I have X amount because I've got this problem? He wants to know what benefit I will get from it. So yeah, please think about giving the solutions rather than more problems and more data. Thank you very much.